At 65, I thought my life had settled into a rhythm too steady to ever be disturbed again. Retirement had left me restless at first, but eventually I leaned into the predictable routines. The early mornings with black coffee on the porch. The walks through the quiet streets of our coastal town in Northern California. The crossword puzzles I filled in with half-bored precision. My wife, Helen, still worked part-time at the library. Her love for books too stubborn to fade with age, and our children were grown. Scattered across states, absorbed in their own marriages and careers. I had convinced myself that my days of hunger, for risk, for recognition, for desire, had quietly expired along with the last office badge I surrendered when I walked out of my engineering firm 6 years earlier. I told myself it was enough, that stillness was a kind of reward. And then she arrived, carrying something in her presence that felt like a mirror turned toward the part of me I had buried under years of duty and predictability. It began on an ordinary Thursday. One of those days when the sun hovers pale behind the coastal fog and the air smells faintly of salt and eucalyptus. I had volunteered to help at the community center, repairing shelves and tightening loose screws on the benches in the recreation hall. Helen had nudged me into it, insisting I keep my hands busy. A phrase that carried both affection and impatience. She believed I would rot from idleness otherwise. When I pushed open the glass door, toolbox clattering against my knee, I noticed her right away. She was standing near the bulletin board, pinning up a flyer with a strip of bright tape. A woman not young, not old, somewhere in between that resists definition. Her hair was dark with a few threads of silver, tied carelessly back. And she wore a green blouse that seemed to gather the light around her. She was laughing with someone at the desk. A quick low laugh that didn't ask permission from the room. I pretended not to look too long, but when she turned her head, our eyes met. And something lodged in my chest with a force that unsettled me. She walked toward me later, introduced herself as Marisa. She had just moved to town, a widow, offering to organize art classes for the seniors. Her voice carried the trace of somewhere else, maybe New Mexico or Arizona. Soft vowels stretched like desert horizon. I nodded, offered my hand, felt hers warm and certain. Nothing remarkable in the exchange. Nothing that could not be dismissed as polite civility, except for the aftertaste of it. The way her presence lingered long after she stepped away. I told myself it was curiosity, the harmless spark of novelty. Yet when I returned home that evening, Helen's chatter about library budgets and the new shelving project felt like background noise against the echo of Marisa's laugh. I hated myself for noticing, hated the way my mind replayed the tilt of her head, the way her blouse caught light. Desire was supposed to belong to younger men, to lives still searching for definition. At 65, wasn't I supposed to be finished with that? The following week, she was there again, arranging brushes and small easels in the hall. She asked me to help carry boxes of paints from her car, and I did. Though the tools in my garage sat neglected. We made small talk, about the stubborn fog. About how she found the coastal air both calming and heavy. When she smiled at me, it wasn't flirtation, at least not obviously. It was something deeper, an acknowledgement that she saw me not as Helen's husband. Not as the quiet retiree who fixed benches, but as a man who could still be noticed. That recognition, it terrified me. That night, Helen sat across from me at dinner, her glasses perched on her nose, telling me about a teenager caught slipping romance novels under his jacket. I nodded, spooned lentil soup into my mouth, and wondered how many years it had been since she looked at me the way Marisa had. Memory failed me. Desire crept in quietly, like tidewater seeping under a closed door. It did not announce itself with grand declarations. It revealed itself in restless sleep. In the sudden care I took when buttoning my shirt before heading to the community center. In the way I shaved twice in 1 week, though Helen hardly noticed. I began anticipating Thursdays with an eagerness that unsettled me. Watching the clock hands inch forward, as though I were a boy waiting for summer. Marisa and I grew familiar through fragments. She told me her late husband had been a teacher. That she missed the sound of his chalk on a board. She confessed she hadn't painted seriously in years but wanted to rediscover the colors. I told her about my engineering projects, about bridges and structures I'd designed. Though I left out the loneliness of retirement. Our conversations were simple, but underneath them ran a current neither of us acknowledged. Then came the afternoon that stripped away denial. I had stayed late, repairing a jammed window. She was in the hall, cleaning brushes, the scent of turpentine sharp in the air. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that magnifies every small sound, the drip of water in the sink, the scrape of bristles against tin. She asked me if I ever missed my younger years. I laughed it off, said I was too old to bother with nostalgia. But she shook her head. "You don't look old to me," she said softly. Something shifted then. My hands stilled on the window latch. I turned, and our eyes locked in a silence that carried every unspoken thought. It wasn't a dramatic leap, not some cinematic sweep into embrace. It was smaller, more dangerous. A hand brushed against mine as she reached for the rag. And I didn't pull away. Her skin was warm, her pulse steady. For a moment, time collapsed, and I felt 30 again, reckless and alive. I pulled back, muttered some excuse about the window, left too quickly. But walking home, the street lamps flickering on one by one, I realized something irreversible had begun. That night, lying beside Helen in the bed we had shared for 4 decades, I stared at the ceiling and felt the thrum of something I thought long buried. At 65, I had discovered desire again, not gentle or sentimental, but sharp and demanding. And I understood with a dread that thrilled me too. Once desire finds you, it does not let go. The days that followed were a battle between reason and pulse, and reason was losing ground. I told myself to avoid the community center. To spend Thursdays mowing the lawn or driving inland where the fog lifted into sun. But each week I found myself unlocking that same glass door, toolbox in hand. Inventing new repairs that no one had asked me to make. Helen noticed my eagerness and teased me about being the town's oldest handyman. But she didn't suspect more than that. Her trust, unshaken after 40 years, became both a shield and a wound. Marisa's presence grew larger in my thoughts, filling the spaces where silence used to be. She never spoke of attraction, never crossed an obvious line. But everything about her unsettled the air between us, the way her eyes lingered just long enough to question, the way her laugh landed in my chest like a spark. One Thursday, rain drummed on the center's roof, and hardly anyone came. I was fixing a broken chair in the corner when she walked over carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed me one without asking if I wanted it, as though she already knew. The steam fogged my glasses, and I felt ridiculous, wiping them while she smiled. "You look younger when you take those off," she said, and the remark, casual as it seemed, landed with the force of confession. I laughed too loudly, tried to hide the flush in my face. but her eyes stayed on me as if she saw straight through the performance. We sat together as the rain poured, speaking of trivialities that were not trivial at all. The taste of coastal air compared to the desert where she grew up. The stubborn ache in our knees that reminded us of age. The ways we both pretended not to feel lonely even when surrounded by people. She touched my arm once to emphasize a point. And I swear my body remembered that touch the way it remembers pain or hunger. That night I dreamed of her. Nothing explicit. Nothing cinematic, just her hand reaching for mine across a table. Her lips forming words I could not hear. I woke with my heart racing, ashamed to find my body reacting as though I were 25. Again, lying there beside Helen. I stared at the dark ceiling and realized the dreams were more dangerous than any reality. Dreams don't fade with daylight, they seed themselves into waking hours. The following week she asked me if I wanted to see her studio. She said it lightly, as if it were no different than offering me another cup of coffee. But my chest tightened at the invitation. I told her I'd think about it, though by the time I walked home I already knew I would go. The house she rented sat a few streets back from the bluff. Small and weathered but alive with color, canvases leaning against the walls. Jars of brushes lined up on the sill, the scent of linseed oil thick in the air. She showed me a half-finished painting, a stormy sea with streaks of gold breaking through. And asked my opinion. I mumbled something about structure and balance. Words that belonged more to my engineering past than to art. But she listened as if my view mattered. When she poured us glasses of red wine, I should have left. Every instinct of loyalty, every vow I had spoken decades earlier, should have pulled me back toward the door. But I stayed, sipping the bitter wine that tasted of temptation itself. The conversation drifted into personal terrain, her husband's sudden illness. The silence of the house after he died. The fear that she would vanish into invisibility now that her children lived far away. I told her about retirement, about the way days stretched blank. About how Helen and I had grown into parallel lives, intersecting only in routine. There was no plan, no conspiracy in what followed. She reached for my hand across the table, and this time I didn't move. The warmth of her fingers against mine carried more weight than 1,000 words. I should have stopped it there, but desire had already laid its claim. She leaned closer, her hair brushing my cheek. And for the first time in decades I kissed a woman who was not my wife. The kiss was hesitant, brief, yet it broke something sacred that could never be mended. I walked home that night in a haze, the streets glistening with rain. Each step heavier with the knowledge of betrayal. Helen was asleep when I entered, her breathing steady. The quilt rising and falling with innocence I no longer possessed. I stood at the doorway for a long time, guilt burning my throat. And still I could taste Marisa's lips on mine. I thought it would end there, that the shame would be enough to pull me back into line. But shame is a poor guard against desire. The following Thursday, I found myself back at her studio, this time without pretense. We spoke less and touched more, the restraint between us dissolving like fog in sunlight. Her body was not young, but it was real, warm. Alive in ways that reminded me mine still was too. For a man who had resigned himself to the slow decline of age, it was intoxicating to be seen. To be wanted, to feel hunger mirrored back. Days became divided into two lives, the one with Helen, predictable and unbroken. And the one with Marisa, secret and urgent. I grew skilled at lies, small, efficient lies about errands and repairs. Lies that slid off my tongue too easily. Helen trusted them without question, and that trust only deepened my self-disgust. Yet each time I told myself I would end it, Marisa's touch returned to memory, and resolve collapsed. What shocked me most was not just the desire but the way it altered how I saw myself. At 65, I had thought my reflection dull, my edges softened into irrelevance. With Marisa, I felt dangerous again, capable of choices that could topple entire lives. It was terrifying, and it was addictive. One evening, as we lay tangled in the sheets of her small house, she whispered, "Do you ever wish we'd met years ago?" I couldn't answer. The question carried too much weight, what it implied about regret, about fate, about the lives we had already built with others. Instead, I kissed her, as if lips could silence the truth. But later, walking home under the dim streetlights, her words followed me like footsteps. Did I wish it? Perhaps. Or perhaps I feared that meeting her younger would have destroyed everything even faster. By then, the line between caution and recklessness had blurred beyond recognition. I carried Marisa's presence with me into every room. Even the one where Helen and I shared dinner. Even the one where we folded laundry together in silence. Desire had found me at 65. And with it came not just hunger but danger, the danger of discovery, of collapse. Of realizing that the life I had so carefully preserved was far more fragile than I ever imagined. And I began to wonder, not with fear but with a strange, reckless curiosity. How long before the tide came in and drowned everything? Secrecy became my second skin, stitched tighter with every passing week. And yet the more careful I tried to be, the more reckless my heart grew. I carried Marisa in the smallest gestures. When Helen asked me to pick up groceries, I lingered in the wine aisle, remembering the bottle Marisa preferred. When Helen ironed my shirts, I thought of how Marisa ran her hand over my collar as if smoothing fabric were an act of tenderness. The guilt was constant, but guilt did not stop me, it only deepened the thrill. Made every encounter feel like defiance against the quiet death of age. At the community center, I learned to disguise glances. To stand at just the right distance when others were around. But in the studio we were without masks. Her house smelled of turpentine and rosemary from the potted plant on the sill. A combination I began to crave, as if that scent itself were a password unlocking the life I couldn't admit to anyone else. It was there, one gray afternoon, that I noticed something unsettling. I had arrived earlier than usual, and Marisa seemed distracted, brushes scattered, her canvas left untouched. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. I asked if something was wrong. She hesitated, then admitted she had run into Helen at the library. That she'd gone in to look for art history books and Helen had helped her find them. My chest tightened, though I forced a laugh. She didn't suspect anything, Marisa assured me, but it felt strange. Strange was too mild. The thought of the two women speaking, one oblivious, the other holding my secret in her hands, rattled me more than I cared to admit. That night, Helen mentioned it casually over dinner. Met a lovely woman today at work. She's teaching art at the center. She said you've been fixing things there. She smiled at me with unknowing affection, and I nearly choked on my food. I managed some excuse about volunteering, but inside I was spiraling. Desire had brought me back to life, yes. But it had also woven a trap that tightened each time Helen spoke Marisa's name. I tried to pull back. The next week I told Marisa we should slow down. That it was too dangerous. She listened silently, her eyes calm in a way that unnerved me more than anger would have. You think you can bury it again? she asked quietly. You think it won't come back to claw at you in the dark? I had no answer. She kissed me anyway, and the protest I'd rehearsed dissolved. So the affair deepened, not despite the risk but because of it. Every brush with exposure fed the hunger. I began to notice details I'd overlooked before. Helen's habit of leaving her phone face down on the table, the way she hummed while cooking as though nothing in the world troubled her. I envied her innocence, even as I betrayed it. And yet, some part of me longed to be caught, to have the decision ripped from my hands. One evening, after a long day with Marisa, I returned home to find Helen sorting through an old box of photographs. She handed me one without looking. It was of us at our daughter's wedding. My arm around her waist, my eyes alight with pride. We looked happy then, she said softly, almost to herself. I nodded, unable to speak. The photograph burned in my hand like evidence of a crime. That night I dreamed of Marisa again, but this time Helen was there too. Watching from the doorway, I woke drenched in sweat, heart hammering as though the dream were prophecy. The following Thursday brought the moment that changed everything. I had gone to Marisa's house, as usual, and we were sitting close on her couch when a knock rattled the door. She froze, eyes wide. My stomach plummeted. She peeked through the curtain, then exhaled with relief. It was a neighbor dropping off mail. We laughed shakily after she left, but the terror of that instant lingered. It was proof of how close we stood to ruin. Still, the next hour we clung to each other more fiercely than ever, as if daring the world to crash in. Walking home later, I rehearsed excuses in my head for why I'd been gone so long. But when I entered, Helen was on the porch with tea, smiling. You're late, she said, not accusing, just observant. I muttered something about fixing a stubborn door at the center. She accepted it easily, and that trust, the ease with which she believed me, struck harder than suspicion ever could. I sat beside her, the warmth of her shoulder brushing mine. And for a moment I wanted to confess everything, to unburden the lie that grew heavier each day. But the words caught in my throat, strangled by fear. Instead, I sipped her tea, bitter and hot, and told her nothing. Over the next weeks, the tension wound tighter. Marisa grew bolder, sometimes sending me notes slipped into my toolbox. Sketches of stormy seas or lonely figures with eyes too much like mine. Helen grew unknowingly closer, inviting Marisa to dinner after seeing her again at the library. She's new here, must be lonely, Helen said with kindness. I panicked, inventing excuses, delaying, but I knew sooner or later our worlds would collide. And when they did, the fallout would be catastrophic. At 65, desire had not just found me, it had cornered me, daring me to choose between the life I had built and the life that made me feel alive. And in the silence of night, with Helen's steady breathing beside me, I realized with dread that I no longer knew which one I wanted more.